Okay, so you've got an image off your digital camera. You've got a real nice fancy DSLR and shoots 18 megapixels. And you bring it into Photoshop and you're like, I just need to create a 4x6 print of this and put it on an inkjet printer. How do I do that? How do I change the size of my image? Typically what you do is you go to the image size dialog box. It's located under the image menu. So image size. And let's talk about this dialog box because it's potentially confusing for a lot of people actually. Even talking to people who've been using Photoshop for years and they still are kind of confused by what this dialog box is all about. So let's make it simple. I'd break it into two parts. There's the upstairs and the downstairs. Upstairs easy, downstairs hard. Now, why is the downstairs harder than upstairs? Because downstairs has one more thing that you have to think about, and that's resolution. We'll talk about that in just a second. The other potentially confusing thing about this dialog box is that it actually has two modes. It can be used to resize an image, or it can be used to resample in an image. And there's a difference between resize and resample. The default is to have this turned on to resample. I'm going to turn that off. And note that when I do that, the upstairs becomes unavailable. I can't actually change the number of pixels in the file when resample is turned off, which means all I'm really doing is changing how this image will be printed, what size it will be printed at when you hit the print command. You're not actually changing the amount of information in the file at all, only how it gets output. So I said I wanted a 4x6. So right now the width off the camera, this is a very large dimensionally file. It's 32 roughly inches by 48 inches, but it has a very low resolution. It's 72 pixels per inch here. If I change the width to 4, so 4 inches, because I'm not changing the number of pixels in the file, I'm just changing the dimensions. In this case, I'm making the dimensions go down. Resolution has to go up, right? Because it's the same number of pixels. It's just to fit into a smaller rectangle, the pixels have to get smaller, right? So the smaller the pixel, the higher the resolution. That's kind of how this works. Now, okay, you might understand that. Great. I've turned off resample, which means it's a non-destructive action. I'm not changing the number of pixels in the file. I'm only changing how it's going to print. You click OK, and this is where people sometimes get confused because it didn't appear that anything happened. You know, the file doesn't look different on screen. And that's exactly what's supposed to happen, right? Because you did a resize, not a resample. If I had gone to 100%, let's go ahead and double click on the zoom tool, and I'm viewing the image at 100% view, the actual pixels view. Here you're seeing every single pixel in the image represented by one pixel on the screen of the display. You can see there's a lot of pixels here. It's a big file. If I go back to image size, and you can see it's a 4x6 at 584 pixels per inch. Let's take this back to a 20-inch file, so a 20 by 30. The resolution went down in this case because I made the dimensions larger. Again, because resample is turned off, the number of pixels in the file is not changing, so the pixels have to get larger to fill the larger dimensions that we're changing here. I go ahead and click OK, and again, you might be scratching your head going, but nothing happened on screen. So the summary there is when resample is turned off, you're not actually changing anything about the file within Photoshop except how the file will be printed when you use the print command. Let's go back to image size again. And let's take this resolution back to where we started, 72, which forces the dimensions to go up. Let's turn resample on this time. Now when resample's turned on, suddenly the upstairs is available to use again because this is potentially a lossy operation. You're actually going to be changing the number of pixels in the file. You'll either be removing pixels, in which case the geeky term for that is downsampling, or you'll be adding pixels that don't even exist, and that's called upsampling. If I change the width here to 4, the height, retains its proportion by default, so it goes to 6 inches, but note that the resolution did not change anymore because they're not connected anymore when resample's turned on. You can change these independently, whereas when resample was turned off, changing the width or height changed the resolution correspondingly, and vice versa. If I change the resolution, the width and height change. Now, if you take a look at the upstairs, it's actually giving you a clue of what's going on here. The original file was 23 megabytes, but because we made the dimensions smaller and we did not change the resolution, we are throwing away a gigantic amount of those pixels and ending up with a 364K file. And now if I click OK, You're like, oh, something happened. It got smaller on screen. Yes, it got smaller on screen because we actually threw away a large number of pixels. We're still viewing it at the 100% view, and because there's fewer pixels in the file, it takes up less screen real estate to represent the image. Okay, I'm going to undo that. Command-Z, Control-Z on Windows, and go back to image size. Now, when you have resample turned on, which again is the default, you're not just changing how this file will be printed when you hit the print command. You're also changing the physical size of the file, the number of pixels in that document. And like I said, if you change the dimensions smaller and keep the resolution low, you're getting rid of pixels that were present that you don't feel you need anymore. And if you make the dimensions larger or the resolution larger than what you started with, that's called upsampling. You're asking Photoshop to invent pixels that don't exist. So usually a question I get is, okay, I've got this file. It's as big as it can be as it is, but I need to make it a little bit bigger. Maybe I'm starting with an 8x10 image at 300 DPI, and I want to print it as, an 11x14, let's say. So how big can you make it in Photoshop? Well, typically what most people say is if you're going up about, say, 25% from your original dimensions, you're probably not going to be able to spot that too badly. You probably get a good enough job there, especially because the larger the print, the farther away you're intended to be from when you're looking at it, right? If you're looking at a billboard, let's say, you're not standing right next to a billboard. You're looking at a billboard from, hundreds of feet away potentially. So you don't need a lot of resolution in that regard because you're going to be looking at it from quite a distance. So anyway, all I'm trying to say is if you're going to upsample an image in Photoshop, going anywhere from 10 to 20% larger than what you're starting with is probably not the end of the world, and you probably won't even notice. If you need to go much larger than that, then there actually are third-party products that do a much better job of upsampling beyond the capabilities of what Photoshop can do on its own. And if that's something you need, I check out one of the products from On1 Software. It's just on1.com or on1software.com. And they have a product called Genuine Fractals that you can take a look at that does a really good job of upsampling beyond that 20% threshold that I'm recommending you stay within. Last point to make is that if you are resampling an image, whether you're making it have fewer pixels or have more pixels, you actually have a choice of how the resampling gets done. There's another geeky term called an algorithm. What math should Photoshop use to get you the result you're looking for? The default is bicubic, again, another geeky name. And at least now they actually give you a description of what that means. It's best for smooth gradients. There are two other options that you might want to take a look at. One is bicubic smoother. So if you're making that image larger than the number of pixels that you have, you would want to change the algorithm for resampling to bicubic smoother. It's going to give you much better results. Bicubic sharper is typically what you want to do if you're taking a file smaller, which most of the time, especially with today's digital cameras, you're capturing so many pixels. You typically are downsampling your images, especially if you're posting it to a web page or doing a photo gallery or just showing it up on a mobile device or something. You're certainly not going to send this huge amount of pixels to those particular outputs. So I actually changed my default resampling algorithm to bicubic sharper, and I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. But typically, you're going to get a lot better results by choosing bicubic sharper. What that does is make the file smaller and does a sharpening pass behind the scenes to retain edge detail. Okay, so if I was doing this as a 4x6 to my inkjet printer, in the previous video, we talked about what type of resolution you need based on output. It turns out that inkjet printing, a good number is somewhere between 240 and 300 dots per inch. We said we wanted this to be a 4x6. And so I'm downsampling this image down to about 4 megabytes. The dimensions are 4x6, the resolution is 240. I've chosen bicubic sharper to give me the best results. Go ahead and click OK. And there's my file, and I'm ready to go ahead and print it. If you were following the algorithm discussion there about bicubic versus bicubic smoother and bicubic sharper, and you find that most of the time you're going to be starting from a large file and making it smaller, then you'll want to change your preference. Go to Photoshop Preferences on the Mac, and we can just go to General. On PC, we go to the Edit menu, or Command or Control K will just pop open the dialog. And right there in the General category, the image interpolation default, it's right now set to bicubic. That's the out-of-the-box default. If you're finding you're constantly making your images smaller, then change it to bicubic sharper as the default so that the next time you go to image size, that dialog, it will already be set to the interpolation choice that's going to give you the better looking result.